resourcing, etc. And then the second side of that is to improve or to learn about our services. And so the reason why that sort of tightrope walker little cartoon is up there is because it is really challenging to balance these two things. Often the kind of questions that you'd ask or the kind of measurement you conduct to prove that what you're doing works isn't necessarily the kind of measurement that's going to bring up that improvement and those learning opportunities. And equally, a lot of organisations can shy away. Sometimes I don't think those in the room today, seeing as you signed up for a talk about quant measurement, but some organisations can shy away from doing that measurement piece because they feel that risk around what if this shows that we're not achieving what we're expecting to achieve. And there's a lot of complexity around that, which I'll touch on today in terms of, you know, not all measurement approaches are going to be able to demonstrate that a change has occurred, even if it has occurred. So I'll keep coming back to that, but ultimately we measure to either prove or improve on our services. And then we come to the age-old debate between quant and qualitative measurement. I feel like this Barbie Oppenheimer really captures people's perception on quant and qual. I disagree. I don't think it's as straightforward as this, but yeah, happy to lean into it. So how do we decide between quantitative and qualitative methods, and how do we pick between them? So there's a really sort of core philosophical or epistemological, if you let me be an academic for a second, divide. Ultimately, what it comes down to is in the quantitative world, we believe that people have an objective understanding of their reality in their head that they can draw from. So when you say on a scale of 1 to 5, how happy are you currently with your family functioning? People know it's 4. People have that sort of knowledge and that asset to draw on. In the qualitative world, we believe that there's a more socially constructed and dynamic understanding of reality, and depending on the time and the place and the way that you ask a particular question, you're going to get a different answer. And that answer is not wrong, it's just a different construction. So that's sort of the quant and qual divide. So if you're going, oh, actually, I think I believe more in that, in the latter and that qualitative perspective, maybe start thinking about where you're aligning yourself. The next really important piece is around training and expertise. Doesn't matter how much you want a qual or a quant approach. If you don't have the training in it, it is best to stick in what you know, because you are going to be better at it and you're going to get more useful findings. Existing knowledge and description of the construct is a really important one. So there's a lot of constructs or variables or outcomes that are really well defined, and we've got a really good sense of them. Things like mental health, general health, family functioning, you know, even housing and homelessness, what homelessness as an outcome looks like. We're pretty solid on what that looks like, and so we can have those fixed quantitative measures around them. Something, for example, I've had people ask in the past, you know, do you have a quantitative measure of how cultural background leads to different employment pathways? And no, we don't have a quantitative measure on that because it's a very soft and sort of moving and undefined concept. And so it lends itself more to that qualitative paradigm where you're trying to sort of dig out sort of what the core understanding is. The most important thing is the focus of the research question. So when you're picking between quantitative and qualitative, it's really important to ask yourself, what is the question that we're ultimately wanting, and what kind of data can speak to that question? Data availability is also a big one. If you've got you know, a really rigorous intake survey or an intake process, for example, and you're collecting a ton of data, like that's such useful data, and don't ignore it and don't sort of leave it behind in preference of anything else. So what you have access to definitely comes into picking. And then also the needs and preferences of your evidence consumers. So in the sector, those consumers are yourselves, your colleagues, but also your funders. So ultimately, we kind of do have to prescribe a little bit to what our funders prefer, but I will touch on that a bit later. So in terms of that key piece, which is research questions, as a super rough guide, this is a very rough guide, but quantitative research questions typically revolve around things like descriptive statistics. So what percentage of our clients have X condition, how many people come through our doors per week. Hypothesis testing. So this is where you've got a clear vision of, you know, we believe that, you know, having more than 5 sessions with us will lead to an increase in mental health outcomes. So you've got a clear vision of X leads to Y, and you're wanting to test if that actually occurs. Explanatory or causal mechanisms. So for example, we believe that people in our service who have a pre-existing NDIS plan are going to find it easier to access a particular secondary service. So that sort of, again, it's that we've got a predefined concept of this leading to this. And again, the concepts are really well defined and understood. So even as I've been rattling off all of those, I'm talking about NDIS, service access, mental health, family functioning. So it's those sort of clear and well-defined concepts. Qualitative is more around the understanding of individual experiences. So for example, if you're wanting to know how do people with an NDIS service plan perceive accessing housing and homelessness services, again, it's that softer. We're not saying it's X leads to Y, it's sort of what are people experiencing. You might want to explore ideas, thoughts, meanings and consequences and develop your understanding. So it's a more sort of exploratory. You don't really know exactly what's happening and you're wanting to see how people perceive it. And also fuzzy, novel or undefined concepts. So things, for example, coming up, we're doing a research study around AI and childhood sexual abuse. Like they're two, we know about AI, we know about childhood abuse, but how those two fit together isn't something that's like there's no fixed quantitative measure around that yet. So it really lends itself to that more qualitative exploration. So broadly, they're the two differences. In terms of what the sector is doing currently, so this comes from research from myself and Cameron Parcell. We did a systematic review of evaluation and outcome measurement reports from the non-for-profit sector. What we can see is that quant and qual methods are pretty broadly and equally spread between the two. It was about the same. But what we do see is that quantitative measures are more frequently used to measure clients' experience, whereas qualitative measures are more often deployed with staff, which is sort of an interesting use of the two. And I think it really comes back to this point around resource intensity, which I'll come to now. So when we're trying to decide why would we do a quantitative survey, if there's one thing you can take away from today, which I'd love to spread more throughout the sector, is that we do not use quantitative surveys because we feel we should, because we feel we have to, because we think it's what everyone else is doing, or because when we say, I need to measure my outcomes, for some inexplicable reason, a vision of a bar chart pops into your head. They aren't good reasons to do quant measurement. Good reasons to do quant measurement are that it can be more robust and objective measures of your outcomes and of your cohort. It can enable benchmarking to population outcomes or to other services. You can compare between groups. You can provide standardized measurement for your funders and your and for your contractual compliance, and it can be less resource intensive. So they're the 5 good reasons. So if they're 5 things that you're interested in, that would be a good indication to pursue quant measurement. But just because they are positives that can come out of quant measurement doesn't mean that they always come out of it. So it's really important. And what I'm going to take you through now is some of the big pitfalls that lead to us, not actually meeting these benefits. My passion for good quantitative survey design, which is it's the nerdiest thing to have a passion for, but I feel like I'm in good company because you guys all signed up to come and hear me talk about it, so right out of my master's degree, I was working as a research intern at this big international aid research consultancy. And they were doing a United Nations study looking at migrants and refugee housing experiences. It was actually in Jordan and actually in Gaza at the time. And they used a quantitative survey. It was about 1,500 families. The survey went for an hour. So it was a bit over an hour. So it was about 2,000 hours of participant time, which is a huge allocation. The total study cost about £2 million, not AU, pounds. And the survey, as we found out when the data came in, was really terribly designed. It just wasn't well thought out at all. And so for £2 million and 2,000 hours, we got a bunch of flat histograms that really couldn't tell us about people's experiences. And it was honestly one of the worst things I've ever seen happen. And since then, I have seen that happen again in the not-for-profit sector, where things just fall short, where you sort of put a lot of resources towards measuring through quant, and it just doesn't provide you with what it needs to. When it's well thought out, it can provide immense benefit, but it does need to be really well thought out. So in terms of your robust and objective measurement, so why is quant inherently more robust and objective? It isn't. We all know that if I go out right now and ask my 2 favourite work colleagues on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being extremely and 5 being superb, how good of a public speaker I am, and they both say 5, and I come back and say 100% of people rate me as a 5 as a public speaker, that's not robust and objective. It's a terribly designed survey. And that's obviously an extreme example. But, there are other places we can fall down. So in terms of making sure that quantitative is robust and it is objective, we need to follow sort of the core principles of the quantitative paradigm. And those are that we use valid and objective questions, that we have adequate sample sizing, and that we do have some sort of statistical testing or sort of consideration of error in our design. So those of you who have heard me speak before will have heard me harp on about validity and reliability. It's really important. It's really the thing that led to that, for example, that UN study not landing where it needed to. So in terms of psychometrics, there's three concepts. So you've got validity, reliability, and responsiveness. So I always use sort of a building example. So validity is if you tell your apprentice to measure the door, but they don't measure the door, they measure the window. That's not a valid measure. So it's not tapping into what we think it is. A classic example of this in quant measures is often things around sex or drug use. You're asking people how frequently they engage in those behaviours. You're actually more likely to be measuring their level of sort of shame or social consciousness, because you're not actually tapping into how often they do that. It's about how comfortable they are telling you that they do that. Reliability is the extent to which the survey tool can measure the same thing consistently. So again, you tell your apprentice to measure the door and they use it measuring their feet instead of real feet. And all of a sudden your measure's off and your door's not going to fit. So that's reliability. A lot of this comes into how clear the questions are. So when you read that question, how clear is it what they're asking, or can you interpret things slightly differently every time that you ask them? So this is often why I always prescribe that you should be able to have really short quantitative survey measures. But for example, I've said a few times, how would you rate your family functioning as an example? If you've just had a fight with one child, you might rate it really low. But then if you've just had a good family dinner, you might rate it high. And so what we often do to increase reliability is to split that construct out. So it might be, how often do you have disagreements within your household? How, are you satisfied with how many nights a week you eat dinner together? So if you split it out, you're more likely to be able to draw on a tangible thought. Does that make sense? And then responsiveness is the extent to which a quantitative survey tool can detect a change. This one doesn't apply so much. The building analogy of the good old brick veneer doesn't fit here. But if you think about those really big skyscrapers, which are designed to be able to sway in the wind, you need to get your measurement down to sort of laser precision to make sure that it's exactly, you can detect if it's off by a micromillimeter. And responsiveness is sort of where a lot of the measures fall down for the not-for-profit sector. Because when we're not doing, if you think about our interventions, it's often one of 50 things people are going through. They're experiencing extreme vulnerability. We're doing the best that we can, but we might not be leading to massive, massive changes. And so can those measures actually detect if a change has occurred? So how do we know if a measure is valid and reliable? This is the thing that Amplify ultimately aimed to support. It is the hardest thing and it's the biggest stumbling block for the non-for-profit sector. Unfortunately, measures with really strong psychometric assurance are less likely to have been used in the population surveys, so not really helped out there. The review that Paco Perales and I did of psychometric indicators available for the sector did show that health and well-being, so if you're measuring anything towards health and well-being, you're more likely to be able to find that measure, shortly followed by social cohesion, but things like education, climate and energy and employment, it's quite hard to find valid measures. There is constant and ongoing work to develop more indicators. And so this is the two main things I'd recommend is to sort of follow what the best practice and what the organisations in your space who are leading are doing, and also to email a relevant academic. So if you're looking for a particular measure, it might be me, but it might, for example, if you work in migrant and refugee mental health, try to find out which academics work in that space and email them asking if there are any measures that they recommend. Anyone who doesn't reply to that email with something useful is a massive shame on the academic institution. That we absolutely should be providing that kind of support. So that would be my advice for that. So in terms of designing your own questions, as you've seen, it's pretty easy, even when we go through really rigorous testing, it's pretty easy to come up with questions that don't actually tap into what they need to. So the most common pitfalls to avoid are writing questions that people don't actually have the answers to in their own mind. So for example, on a scale of 1 to 7, how much did your childhood upbringing influence your career trajectory? No idea. I don't know. I can't think of what that would be, and depending on what mood I'm in or how I'm identifying on the day, I'm going to answer anywhere between 1 and 7. So make sure people actually, are they likely to have that knowledge in their brain? And the best way to test that is to speak it out with your colleagues. You know, is this a reasonable thing to ask people? Make sure you only ask one question. So for example, I've seen this one so much. On a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate the quality and accessibility of our facilities? That's 2 questions. You might have really high quality facilities, but the accessibility might be terrible, and you've only given them one scale. So which question should they answer? I particularly see this in relation to that quality. So things like, how would you rate the approachability and helpfulness of your caseworker? Again, that's actually 2 questions. It's not one. So make sure you split those out. And then also consider cultural language differences. So things like, are you married? A lot of different cultures don't use that term. Like they might be living in a domestic partnership for the last 20 years. They might have 3 children and split assets and be sort of fitting within all of those norms of marriage, but they might not call it marriage. So you might pick up on what you think you will. Similar one with housing and homelessness. So are you currently experiencing homelessness? No, I'm sleeping in my car. Well, that is actually the definition of homelessness, still fits in there. So make sure you pay attention to that. So on to the second point. So benchmarking is, I think, one of the biggest strengths of quantitative measurement. It involves the comparison of your client data to population data sources or other organisations. So the big trick here, and where people fall down, is that you have to be using the exact same question for benchmarking to be possible. If you change the wording, if you change a word, if you change the scale, so they say a 1 to 5 and you say a 1 to 7, you no longer can benchmark. It's not going to be sort of that same measurement. And equally, things like, again, that are you currently experiencing homelessness? If the organisation that first conducted that survey provide prompts around what homelessness looks like and you don't, or they didn't provide it and you did, again, your data can start to not match up with what the benchmarking original context was. So what I've listed here are the 5, from my perspective, main population surveys. These aren't, what I've given you here is actually, these are the useful links. This isn't the background information about the survey. This is the actual survey. So if you're looking for questions, what I would really recommend is going to the one of these that's most similar to what you're looking to measure and read through the questionnaire and find the questions that you like. Make sure you, if you want a benchmark, make sure you use the exact question wording. I think that's everything I wanted to say there. I have to come back to it. I swear I had a second point. Oh, so things like building a new life in Australia has been discontinued, which is unfortunate. So you're not going to have super up-to-date, well, you're not going to have up-to-date population data. But I'd still recommend, you know, if you're working with migrants and refugees, it is definitely a good place to look for those questions. The other thing I'd love to see happen in the social sector more, and I know speaking to some of the large organisations that have a lot of measurement now, a lot of background, is they're really happy to share their current outcomes framework. So if there is a larger organisation that you know are really comfortable in the measurement space in your area, do reach out to them and see if they're willing to share their measures, because what that could lead to is long term that we're able to benchmark between organisations and use our own sort of data internally. Benchmarking, so on this, in terms of the most common not-for-profit research, the Personal Wellbeing Index was, of the sample we looked at, the most commonly used measure. It's a really great general wellbeing measure, 5 questions. There's a reference there. The Kessler 10 was the most common mental health measure. And I will make the note as well. Actually, I'll come back to this. I'll come back to that point. And so, etc. So the recovery quality of life. What you can see here is that all of those, except for parenting confidence, by the time we get down to the end, are health and wellbeing measures. So again, you're more likely to have common metrics if you're in the health and wellbeing space. Okay, so in terms of comparison, comparisons are really key. Again, benefit that quant measurement can provide. So you can compare between groups, men and women, Western Australia, Queensland, conditions. It might be, example, that's not homelessness. People who have, have children versus don't have children. Services, so you might compare, you might have 2 youth and family services or 2 different homeless services. You can compare the outcomes of those, or pre-existing exposure. So questions like, Do clients experience better outcomes if they attend more than 8 sessions? So that's comparing people who attended more than 8 and less than 8. So you're creating groups out of your own data then. Do women experience greater outcomes than men? Is there a significant reduction in reoffending among program participants compared to the rest of the population? So what you can see there is, depending on which of those comparisons you're wanting, groups, exposures, like back to the population, you need to make sure you're collecting the data in a way that's going to set you up for that. So again, back to that systematic review of evaluation reports, the most common limitations reported in non-for-profit evaluations were lack of representative sampling. I'll come back to that in a second, small samples, but then no comparison group. So even though the evaluations were set up to compare different programs or different services or exposures, they just hadn't measured those conditions well enough to be able to actually compare, or the sample was too small to enable that comparison. So make sure, and I know it sounds simple, but even things like if your administrative data is collected, for example, through an info exchange platform, and you're sending your survey out on SurveyMonkey, make sure you know before you send it out how you're going to link that data, because people often just don't sort of think ahead to that. And all of a sudden you have this really big sample of outcomes, but you don't know which clients it was back to, and therefore you don't know, exposure length or which services they accessed or how long they accessed for and that kind of thing. So yeah, making sure that you actually collect all the variables. So that was the next one, insufficient variables conducted, so captured. So for example, if you are wanting to compare migrants and refugees who moved to Australia in the 90s versus in the 2000s, you're going to need to collect when did you move to Australia, which I know seems simple, but really thinking ahead to what groups we're going to want to compare and making sure that data is being captured as well as the outcomes is really key. So standardized measurement for funders is the fourth big one, and we see a lot of funders really keen on quantitative measurement, increasingly so with the Australian Centre for Evaluation, and Jim Chalmers really pushing for those RCTs. Quant measurements potentially going to get more prescribed. What's really important is to remember is that what gets measured gets managed. We see this a lot, for example, in the welfare services, we had sort of the creaming and the parking, and depending if you're mandated to perform against particular outcomes, that can skew how you deliver your service. So the big questions to ask is it reasonable for your program or service to shift that outcome? Is the responsibility for shifting that outcome predominantly with your program or service? And then what I really prescribe is what could be learned from this data being collected. There's a really great, what the table on the right hand side there is the impact contingency framework, which was developed by Alnor Ibram, who was at Harvard. So he mapped out 4 different kinds of non-for-profit models. So you have the ecosystem strategy, for example, a homelessness hub. So you're bringing together lots of different services. What he says for that is that they should measure individual outcomes and societal outcomes. So this is where you'd be looking for those sort of big quant population services. So you're sort of bringing together lots of different interventions. Your emergent strategy, so for example, your advocacy interventions, a lot of what QCOS does probably fits within here. What you would be prescribed to measure would be your influence through intermediate outcomes and through reach. So all those sort of social media, how many people see, how many people signed up, how many people interacted with your content, that kind of thing. And then also, are we starting to see changes at the societal level in the way people think? Your niche strategy, this is a really common one that I see trying to use quant measurement, but it's not necessarily something that they should be doing. So it's a really simple linear causal logic. So for example, a food bank, a homelessness shelter, a counselling model, a mental health service. So we have a thing, we give that thing to the person, and that's where the intervention ends. You need to measure outputs. You shouldn't actually be needing to measure outcomes. To put it in the context of health, something like a vaccine would be a niche strategy. So the GP gives you a vaccine. The GP shouldn't be having to measure how safe that vaccine is, or how effective it is, or how many lives it saves. That's what should be done beforehand to be an evidence-based intervention. So if we know that vaccine has a 97% efficacy rate, the GP gives it to 100 people, that's 97 people who shouldn't get that disease. So they should actually just be counting outputs. I've seen a lot of pressure on different organisations who deliver this kind of niche intervention to really demonstrate the outcomes. And it's sort of not your responsibility or something that reasonably within the amount of resourcing that you have, that you can reasonably be expected to demonstrate. And finally, integrated strategy. This is a linear, complicated causal logic. So it's like, for example, an integrated allied health unit. So it's not just sort of lots of services together. They actually sort of flow. So almost like a stepped care model would fit into this. And in that case, you should be measuring outputs, individual and societal outcomes. So basically the top left and the bottom right, so your ecosystem and your integrated, that's where surveys might come in, but not necessarily. On some of those things before, so coming back to the responsiveness of quantitative measures and how well they're able to pick up if a change has occurred, but then also things around comparison. We have just seen in the Department of Social Services payment by outcomes trials that the finding of that review was that none of the services were paid for those outcomes because the measures weren't able to detect significant changes on outcomes. So what that's really showing us is that there's a long way to go before we can start doing outcomes-based commissioning. And a lot of that comes back to the fact that, you know, I put a lot of money on the fact that it's very unlikely that it's those services that didn't lead to positive outcomes. We hear it from the clients, we hear that they are helpful, but the measures aren't sensitive enough or responsive enough to pick up a difference. And then also potentially the data, the sample sizes aren't large enough. So this is something I'm quite passionate about. If you ever have a funding contract you're concerned about and you're not sure that what you're being expected of is fair, or you just want to talk it through, that's something that I'm really passionate about and would be more than happy to chat to anyone. My email's on the last slide, so please reach out to me in that case. So you can have really great standardized measures for funders, but they need to think it through as carefully as I'm telling you guys to think it through. So if you're worried about that, just be cautious. And the last point is that quant measurement can be seen as being less resource intensive. This is what I feel really drives that difference between your quant measurements being sent out to your clients and then your qualitative interviews are being given to staff, because people feel that the quant is less resource intensive. What I have seen though, and I think I love theory of change models. I'm not going to diss them at all. But what I have seen is that when organizations have a really large theory of change model with 20, 30 outcomes, there's a risk that they design a 20 or 30 outcomes survey, and those surveys can take an hour to an hour and 10 to complete. So when you're sending out a survey that long, is it really less resource intensive for your clients than doing, for example, an interview? Yes, it's less resource intensive for your organization because you can sort of just, send out that in a big batch, but ethically do start to think about is it genuinely less resource intensive, and is it a fair thing to be asking of our clients? So as you can see, you might not have been expecting someone who is passionate about quant surveys to be quite so cautious about them, but I think caution is really important because I have seen a lot of orgs spend a lot of resourcing sending out these surveys and not getting what they need from them. So the big questions to ask yourself when thinking, is a survey the right method for us, is do you have the right questions? Are they valid? Are they reliable? Do they measure what you need them to? Can I make the meaning from this data? So do I have a comparison group? But also, does my organization have the skill and the resourcing we need to conduct, the testing to actually make that data speak to us? Am I likely to get an adequate response rate? So in terms of that comparison piece, something that falls down a lot is that non-for-profits can get very, very small response rates because, people are busy, they've got so much going on in their own lives, and you follow them up 6 months later, and you might not get a lot. This is a big thing I always say to my students. If you send out 100 surveys and you get 6 survey responses, that's useless data. There's really nothing you can do with that. If you send out an email asking 100 people to participate in a qualitative interview and you get 6 interviews, it's not good. You're not going to get it published in a peer-reviewed journal, but there's going to be something in there that you can speak to, and particularly on that improvement piece, you're much more likely to get that improvement data. So can your survey data actually answer the research questions? What are we likely to learn from this? So are we going to be able to find out about our service and how to improve it from this? And is it fair to be asking our clients or participants of this? So I would say if you're not sure or no against one or more of those questions, really consider, is a quantitative survey right for you? That said, what I've put at the end of this are Rose's favourite quantitative measurement tools. So if you're like, yep, we definitely want a quant survey, here are my favourites. So the Kessler 5 is half the size of the Kessler 10, just as valid, and you can benchmark because it's just a sample of the questions. This was also validated for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. So the questions that have been removed were the more problematic ones. So this is obviously a mental health measure. Satisfaction with family, I kept on tapping back into that one. So this looks at things like relationship with your partner, partner's relationship with your children, relationship with your parents. This one is in the Hilda survey. So if you need benchmarking, you've got that. You'll have the slides as well, so don't be frantically trying to write out these questions. So job satisfaction, this is a great one. And again, this is the kind of thing where when you say how satisfied are you with your job, people don't know. But if you divide it into pay, job security, the work itself, you start to be able to reasonably answer them. Social support, also in the Hilda survey, so you can benchmark that one. And general life satisfaction, that's a single item. Love a single item question. And then financial wellbeing, I think that was all. No, I put helps in, heaps in, sorry. Financial wellbeing, again, if you divide it out, you can start getting into it, and your general health. So there's my email. I think I've run slightly over, but we've got some time for Q&A.
Thanks so much, Rose. Yeah, that was fast and furious and really, and really useful. In fact, it felt like it went very quickly because that was really useful. Opening up to the group, questions, comments you'd like to make. Look, you've got lots of claps and hearts, Rose, so you did really well. Yeah, like Lee has said there in the chat, I think it's a really good idea to factor in the time spent by your participants, service users, clients in completing requests for data. And I think there are a few organisations here who might be checking their service agreements twice to see whether or not the request for evaluation or the kind of KPIs that we're being asked to measure are really suitable for the kind of work that's being done. Yeah.
Great question there about what's a good response percentage for a quant survey. So you ask 100 people, how many do you need to reply? It's not so much. So what UQ sees is about a 20% response rate is what we expect. It's not about the response rate, though. It's about the power that you get from your sample. So what that depends on largely in the not-for-profit sector, we tend to expect small effect sizes. And then what it further depends on is how many groups and different interventions you're looking to compare between. So I'd say, for example, if you're wanting to compare between people who have had more than 8 and less than 8 sessions, I'd say you want, this is like the most terrible back of envelope calculation ever, but about 60 responses, which is quite a lot. So that's sort of the size that we're talking. So if you're wanting to compare more than 8 and less than 8, and then also English speaking versus non-English speaking background, you're starting to get more like 100 to 120. Again, horrifically back of envelope. But just to give you an idea of the size that you need if you're wanting to do that statistical testing and to get significant differences. Can you please send the slides out, Miss? Yes. How do you answer who should conduct? Yeah. Ruth, what do you mean by who?
Well, I'm just talking about that many organisations don't know whether an external evaluator should be doing it or whether the person actually conducting the service or program should be conducting the survey. It's just a very common question that I hear. Yeah. And I'd be interested in how you advise organisations on who should conduct that survey. Is it someone close or is it someone independent?
Yeah. It's a tricky one. It depends on the relationship. You never want participants to feel coerced or like they have to answer a certain way, because that again ruins all of your measurement. That said, something I do like to see is, for example, if you have to assess risk of dropping out of education and training or employment, as an eligibility criteria, for example, for your service. I really like to see survey tools used in the intake in that process, and that be used as your outcome measurement. So I think in that case where you're having to ask those measures and those questions anyway, I think it can be all right to have a case manager or that support person ask the questions. I think that I know that the consultants and the academics, we've got a lot more resourcing and sort of, we pay for those subscriptions and all those stats packages. So I know it can be, I think if you can afford it, the cost and benefit of working with someone external can help, because you're not going to be able to sort of fork out that level of resourcing yourself. But that said, I think it depends a lot on your clients as well. Sometimes they feel a lot more comfortable having the organisation, for example, send you the email. Sometimes they really like seeing that university or, Big Four consultancy letterhead. So it depends on your org. It's not very helpful answer, Ruth. I like the outcome star as long as it is being used as a clinical, not a clinical. The benefit of the outcome star is that it aims to combine case management and case planning with your outcome measurement. It's not the best outcome measure tool, but I think that dual benefit warrants what it provides, because you are sort of in real time coming up with that improvement information. So it's good in that perspective. Oh, I think that's all the questions. Great comments though, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we did get, if there's any other questions. Oh, here we go. Bindi just scraped through. So Bindi said, I gather feedback from people with cognitive disability that live in supported independent living about their experience of this via an interview. Are you aware of any surveys that target people with cognitive disability?
So there are a few separate outcome measures which have been designed specifically for people with cognitive disability. That's a case where I'd recommend reaching out either to myself or to academics who work in this space for those measures. That said, a lot of those measures have been designed for distribution in like super clinical settings, and so in terms of like supported living, it's not necessarily the best context for that. A lot of what I've seen the expectation be is that through your sort of normal support process of being able to work through forms or planning, that the support person is the one who works through the survey, not as a proxy, sometimes as a proxy, but as somewhere between a proxy and a support during measures that haven't been specifically designed for the cohort. And that's the kind of case where, like the quant measures sort of aren't up to scratch with where they need to be. So think carefully around, do we have to go that way or can we do something else? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. ATSE communities and yarning versus the surveys. I'd like to see, I think more. One thing as well, in terms of doing the qualitative surveys, just because you're doing qual doesn't mean you have to abandon quantitative altogether. So, for example, if you have to measure mental health, you have to measure general well-being, put one of those short measures in at the start or at the end of your qualitative interview, and you can have that more sort of like relational discussion about where they sit, and you still get that final quant measure that you can do comparison and everything too. But then you're also going to get the broader perspective on what they think and feel, and etc.
For those who aren't reading along in the chat, that was just in response to Lachlan's comment around in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, the yarn is more important than the survey, and sometimes that survey approach can be a bit cold and off-putting for people. So it's really important sometimes to combine those approaches. Gail has asked about the usefulness of the CDOI in measuring counselling outcomes. I don't know what that is, Gail.
I just quickly want to say, I know people were talking about the disability survey. I just want to say thank you for talking about that, because I have a disability myself, and I am very passionate about us being more involved with certain things and us being treated the same as everyone in this room. But I just wanted to say thank you, because I just saw it and then I was actually really happy to see that you guys are wanting to make us more involved with such things. So it really does mean a lot, especially when I, for myself, have experience with people not treating me the same, treating me like a child, and just not treating me nicely just because I have a mild autism disability. I know some people have a more severe disability than me, but I'm sure I'm not going to speak for them, but I'm sure they would still like to be treated just like everyone else. I'm sure they would like to be treated normally, they would want to be respected. They want to be involved with such things. That's why I'm here, not in this meeting specifically, sorry, but in this role where I am today. I'm helping support workers learn like what we want to be treated like, how to treat us, like what to expect and all of that. So thank you for whoever mentioned that, because I just wanted to do a pickup about that.
No, thank you. And I think maybe my final comment off the back of that, which really hijacks this meeting about quantitative surveys, is that that's another benefit of the qualitative perspective, is it can be a lot more strength-based and a lot more person-centered. So whenever we're collecting data from our clients, we're wanting to know what their perceptions are and how much they like the service and what they want to be done differently. And that's whether you're quant or qual. But it's a lot more obvious in a qualitative interview when you have someone that you don't know sit down in front of you and say, you know, what's your thoughts on what we can do better? You're the expert in this situation and the expert in how this service operates. Can you please tell us your perspective? So it's really hijacked the quantitative meeting. Unexpected, I know. But yeah, there we are. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you very much. There's I can see that there's a few other questions in the chat. I'm sorry we haven't gotten to absolutely everyone's, but Rose has shared contact details, and we will send out the slides, so there'll be an opportunity to connect with Rose and to benefit from the slides that she's put together.
I'm just going to throw one last thing in there. I can see there's a minor debate going on about the use of combining quant and qual in a survey. There is nothing wrong with that at all. The problem with having qualitative questions in a quantitative survey is that we get very, very small response rates and often very short responses. So what could we do better? You're very likely to get nothing with a smiley face, whereas when in an interview you might get you'll probe for a lot more information. So yeah, if it suits, add qual questions into your quant or ask quant questions during your qual. But yeah, anyway,
I suppose what
you
know, what device people are using to fill out a survey, you know, you're less likely than, you know, you can do a quick tick and flick kind of survey on your phone, for example, but when you start to get into writing paragraphs, it gets a little bit tedious on something like a phone, or even for people who aren't proficient at typing, it becomes a bit difficult. So, and if you're used to using device and not paper and pen anymore, tell you what, filling out a paper form that has qualitative questions on it gets tricky too. You haven't used those muscles for a while. Thanks so much, Rose. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again at some point.
Thanks all. Have a great meeting.